Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride. And this evening we're going to be talking with Dr. Lizzie Eldridge about the third anniversary of the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the Maltese journalist. That anniversary falls today. But before we get to that, we do have all today's headlines, and we start today, as we always do, with the coronavirus statistics update. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 886,407 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 841,175 were confirmed negative, 45,232 were positive. There were 1,196 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, and sadly, there were 9 new reported deaths. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone will necessarily show symptoms, and not everyone will necessarily get themselves tested. As always, we urge you, if you are showing any symptoms, please do book a test as quickly as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 629 people in hospital last night, 58 of whom were in intensive care. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,594. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. And the latest UK daily figures available show that 43,429 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 136 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that the UK should prepare for a relationship with the EU more like that of Australia, which is code for a no-deal scenario. Johnson said the UK would continue negotiations past his self-imposed deadline of yesterday, but that he had to make a judgment about the likely outcome and prepare the country accordingly. He said, "A lot of progress has been made on such issues as social security and aviation, nuclear cooperation and so on," he said. "But for whatever reason, it's clear from the EU summit that after 45 years of membership, they are not willing, unless there's some fundamental change of approach, to offer this country the same terms as Canada." Commenting on the Prime Minister's statement, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said, "It's beyond belief that in the midst of a global pandemic and deep recession, the Prime Minister is telling Scotland to get ready for a disastrous no-deal Brexit. With less than 3 months until the end of the transition period, businesses and people across Scotland will be in despair at this extraordinary statement. At best, this is reckless brinkmanship. At worst, it means the UK government is now actively pursuing a no-deal outcome." A scathing new report has criticised the Tory government's law-breaking internal market bill and echoed warnings that the bill sets up for an attempted power grab against the devolved parliaments. In further mounting evidence over the dangers of the bill, the report published today by the House of Lords Constitution Committee also warned that it authorises conscious and deliberate breaches of the UK's obligations under international law. Scottish Minister for Europe Jenny Gilruth commented, "It is now beyond any doubt that this bill undermines the devolution settlement and constrains the ability of the Scottish Parliament to make distinctive policy choices for Scotland. We agree with the report's conclusion that the government is setting out explicitly to break international law in a way that is without precedent. The UK government should think again. We urge them to abandon this deeply damaging bill." The SNP has said there is no excuse for the UK government's continued failure to provide vital financial support to millions during the pandemic, including the self-employed and small business owners, at the same time as refusing to tackle tax evasion. Stephen Flynn's comments follow the publication of the Public Accounts Committee's latest report on the work of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which criticises the UK government for not doing more to collect tax owed and refusing to find a way of identifying small businesses that had lost out on previous support packages, months after the outbreak began. The SNP has repeatedly called on the UK government to bring in a comprehensive financial package for those who fall through the gaps of current available support, as well as take further and more robust action to tackle tax evasion. The number of newly qualified teachers in Scotland going straight into employment has risen by nearly 30% under the SNP government, according to latest statistics. The figures, released by the Scottish Parliament's Information Centre, show that the cohort of new qualified teachers in posts at publicly funded schools the year following their probation has risen from 57% in 2007-8 to 84% in 2018-19. Analysis also revealed that the number of teachers in Scotland under the age of 45 has risen to 61.5% of the workforce as of 2019. In 2009, the majority of teachers were over 45. Earlier this year, Scotland's Education Secretary John Sweeney pledged £50 million for the recruitment of approximately 850 extra teachers and around 200 ASN staff to support the reopening of schools. US presidential candidates Donald Trump and Joe Biden faced the American public last night in two simultaneous town hall-style events on rival TV networks as they each prepare for the election on November 3rd. Appearing on NBC News from Miami, Florida, Trump delivered a tetchy performance as host Savannah Guthrie repeatedly picked him up on false and misleading statements and pressed him on weak answers. The president again failed to commit to a peaceful transfer of power if he loses, and also seemed to defend the QAnon conspiracy theory by saying he knew nothing about them before saying he knew they were strongly against paedophilia. Biden, appearing on the rival ABC News network from Philadelphia, gave one of his most assured performances of the campaign, focusing heavily on Trump's failure to control the coronavirus pandemic, which has so far claimed more than 200,000 lives across the US. Biden seemed highly engaged throughout the event and even donned a mask to answer more questions from the audience after the event was over. And finally, the SNP is today celebrating victory in the Ellen and District by-election after gaining 42.4% of first preference votes. Louise McAllister was duly elected as the SNP's second councillor for the ward, with the Tories and the Lib Dems gaining 41.7% and 10.2% of the first preference votes, respectively. Labour managed to achieve just 2.9% of first preference votes. This is technically counted as an SNP hold, but was still a surprise result as the Tories had a comfortable lead in first choice votes on the last council election and might have expected more transfers from the other unionist parties. The by-election was called after the SNP's Richard Thompson was elected as the MP for Gordon at last year's general election after beating the Tory incumbent Colin Clark. So that is all the headlines for this evening. And now, before we speak to Lizzie Eldridge about the situation in Malta and the story of Daphne Caruana Galizia, here's a short package that Lizzie put together for us, just telling us a little bit about the background to this terrible story.
3 years ago today, the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated in a car bomb close to her home in Malta. Since then, the demands for justice have only got stronger. At the same time, it's become increasingly clear as to who was involved in Daphne's brutal murder. And the extent of this involvement, both directly and indirectly, is horrifying. 1 year ago, and heavily resisted by the Maltese government, a public inquiry was set up thanks to the persistence of Daphne's family and the Council of Europe. Shortly after, last November, a well-known figure in the Maltese business world, Jürgen Fennick, was arrested while trying to escape from Malta on his luxury yacht. Fennick was the director of Electrogas, a power station at the heart of so many corruption scandals. Electrogas has now been cited as the motivation for Daphne's murder. When she was killed, she was working on thousands of leaked documents connected to the power station. These are now being made public by Daphne's son, Matthew, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who worked on the Panama Papers. These expose the offshore accounts of Conrad Mitzi, then Energy Minister, and Keith Shikembri, the right-hand man of Joseph Muscat, the ex-Prime Minister forced to resign last December in a cloud of suspicion over his role in Daphne's assassination. Both Mitzi and Shikembri were expecting to receive €5,000 per day via another offshore company, 17 Black. This belonged to Jorgen Fennick. Fennick has accused Shikembri of ordering Daphne's murder. In fact, the two men shared a private WhatsApp group with Joseph Muscat, awarded the title of Man of the Year in Organised Crime and Corruption. The extent of this corruption is being revealed through the public inquiry, designed to examine if the state could have prevented Daphne's murder and, indeed, the role the state played in her killing. Testimonies given by government ministers, politicians, public officials, police officers have depicted a political system that is rotten to the core. Many testimonials include the words, "I don't remember, I don't know," indicating that collusion in corrupt practices was and is the order of the day. Following Muscat's resignation, Robert Abela, Muscat's legal advisor, took over as Prime Minister in January, itself controversial, and Muscat's wife, equally steeped in allegations of corruption, campaigned hard for him to get the post. Regarded by many as Muscat's puppet, Abela recently attempted to stop the public inquiry altogether by imposing a December deadline. Perhaps this isn't so surprising, given that it's his government and his political party that are under scrutiny. Nevertheless, just last week, the inquiry board stated its intention to continue its work. In August, Joseph Muscat was called in for police questioning over Daphne's murder. In September, Keith Shikembri was arrested on suspicion of kickbacks and money laundering. On the third anniversary of Daphne's horrific assassination, the involvement of the Maltese government in her murder has become starkly apparent, and the need for the public inquiry to fulfil its mission is imperative.
So welcome to the studio, Lizzie. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now let's go back to the beginning of this story. How did someone like you come to end up in Malta in the first place?
Well, it's quite a long story, so I'll kind of cut it short. Basically, I first went to Malta in 2005 to make a piece of theatre, and I decided to move there 3 years later in 2008 to focus on my artistic career, because prior to that I was teaching theatre in the University of Edinburgh. So really the motivation was to focus more on my artistic work.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, I mean, Malta's a really beautiful country. It must have been great moving there. How long did it take before you realised how much corruption there was in Malta?
Well, you could always smell corruption in Malta, okay? In the sense of, I want some painting done, and somebody says, oh, my uncle can do it for you. Kind of friendly corruption, but you could always kind of smell it and taste it there. But the full extent of the corruption, I didn't really become aware of until quite a while after a new government took over in 2013. It's called the Labour Party, which is, you know, ostensibly socialist, but of course is not. After that, visibly, one of the visible signs of the corruption was the frenetic building work. You know, there was building everywhere. Towers going up, drills happening. It became environmentally and personally, it was a horrific place to live. By the time I left, it was unbearable. Mm-hmm.
And so how did you first come to hear about Daphne Caruana Galizia and the work that she was doing?
She was very well known in Malta. Whether you read her work or not, everybody knew who Daphne was. People spoke about her as Daphne. You know, you didn't really need to use her surnames. But it was only when she was assassinated 3 years ago today that I became aware of a side of Malta that I just didn't know existed. And that side is ugly, it's mafia, it's criminal, it's brutal, and it's barbaric. So it was really with the assassination of Daphne and then all the revelations that followed, and being involved in the protest movement as well, that your eyes were opened, or my eyes were opened, to the extent of the corruption in Malta.
Now, obviously, we're going to hear more about that later in the show, but I wonder, how did you first hear about her death?
I can remember it very clearly. I was teaching English in a language school, and I taught English with a relative of Daphne's. And we were having a laugh that day. It was a Monday. And I remember waving him goodbye as he was leaving the school at about 2:30. Daphne was killed at 3:00. And I went in to teach again. When I came out of my lesson, another colleague came up to me and said, "Have you heard? They've got Daphne." Those were her precise words. And it was just shocking. It was shocking that it was the middle of the afternoon. You're living in what should have been a European democracy, but of course isn't. And everything happens very closely. Everything happens close together in Malta because it's a small country. So Daphne was assassinated literally just up the road from where you are, because everything is close. So I remember it very clearly.
And so what happened next? How did you come to be involved in the campaign for justice for Daphne?
Less than a week later, the following Sunday, there was a massive demonstration in Valletta, the capital city. Thousands of people were there, thousands. And I thought at the time that this was how things would continue, that the protests would just get bigger and bigger. At the same time, almost organically, a group of female activists came together, when now known as Occupy Justice. It's a pressure group, it's not an organised group, women-led organisation. And we just kind of organically came together. There was a camp we set up in front of the office of the Prime Minister in Valletta. And at the beginning of November, a group of us went to visit the then Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, and demanded the resignation of the Attorney General, who's just recently retired. And we demanded the resignation of the Police Commissioner, who this year resigned in disgrace.
And obviously this year, we've started to see some more come out. There do seem to be moves towards some kind of justice. Do you feel like justice is within reach for Daphne and her family?
I think justice is always within reach. We need to get justice. There's no question about that. And we will get justice. I think there's no question about that either. So much has happened. At the end of last year, there were demonstrations in the streets of Valletta on a daily basis. And as a result, Joseph Muscat, the then Prime Minister, was forced to resign. And he did so under a cloud of suspicion about his involvement in the assassination. His right-hand man, who has been accused of ordering the assassination, he resigned. Konrad Mitzi, another cabinet minister who is involved allegedly in a whole ream of dodgy deals, he also resigned. We've had the public inquiry set up, which is an independent inquiry, and we've heard politicians, government ministers, public officials and so on giving evidence at this public inquiry, which is horrific, which points all the fingers towards the highest levels of government. So, and Joseph Muscat, who resigned last year as the Prime Minister, just the other week resigned. He was a backbencher, still a backbencher despite all the allegations made against him, and he resigned from politics just recently. So it felt last year at the demonstrations last year, it felt like we were just a breath away, that and there was a speaker at the rally last year who said, "We will win." And he was right. And you feel you're so close, because in a normal country, and Malta is not a normal country, but in a normal country, Joseph Muscat, Keisha Kembry, who was arrested a couple of weeks back on allegations of money laundering and kickbacks. But, these people should be under lock and key already for their alleged part in the assassination.
Now, Lizzie, in making this show, you've done interviews with John Sweeney and Manuel Delia, we're about to look at. Tell us a wee bit about who they are and how they came to be involved in this.
Well, John Sweeney, I think, is a familiar name to most people. He was a BBC Newsnight journalist for many years. John was involved in trying to get justice for Daphne right from the start. I think I first met him on the 1-year anniversary of Daphne's death, when he came out and gave the memorial lecture and was very present in the protests. John wrote a book with Manuel and another journalist, Carlo Benini, called Murder on the Malta Express, which was published a year ago. And, you know, they found out so much information about Jorgen Fennick, who's now been accused of masterminding the assassination, about Keisha Kembry, Conrad Mitzi, Joseph Muscat, and it's all put together in the form of a very accessible book, even for people who don't know much about Malta or don't know much about Daphne. Manuel has been there from the start. He's a blogger and an activist in Malta, so I know him very well, and he's a friend. He's been part of the movement that we've all been involved in, trying to get justice.
Yeah, so these interviews you conducted earlier this week with John Sweeney and Manuel Delia. Let's have a wee look just now.
So tonight we've got here with us two people, John Sweeney, the writer and journalist, and Manuel Delia, who's a blogger and activist working in Malta. I'd like to ask you both, but if we can begin with John first, can you tell us a bit about your involvement in the campaign to get justice for Daphne Caruana Galizia? Talk about some of the work that you've done, that you do, and why this is so important to you.
So, you know, listen, I'm not an activist. I'm a journalist. At the time I was working for the BBC Newsnight. We see the story, this horrible car bomb, and I've never been to Malta before, and I'm aware of Daphne's heroic journalism, but I don't know the story well. And the moment I get there, it's obvious that something very, very dark has happened. And this isn't small beer. It's not some small island story. This woman, Daphne Caruana Galizia, was a hero, and she was blowing her whistle loud and strong and pure, trying to get the world to understand that something very dark was happening on Malta. And it had massive implications. Her warnings had implications not just for Malta, not just for Europe, not just for Britain, but also the United States, the whole democratic world. And then it's obvious that something very bad is happening inside Malta's government, that it's rotten, and somebody powerful connected to the government or in the government wanted her silenced, and they did so in the most brutal way imaginable. Now, what happened was that I started off doing one news story, and then I became hooked by the monstrous crime that had happened in Malta, and in the course of which I got to know Manuel. We became friends, and he asked me, could I help him write this book about Daphne's murder? And we were also joined by a wonderful Italian journalist, Carlo Benini, and the three of us wrote this book. And it is a tribute to this great woman, and it's one of the most exhilarating and wonderful things I've done with my life to co-write this book. And at the same time, it's a tragedy because there was no good reason for her to have been murdered in this way. No good reason at all.
Thank you. Manuel?
Well, the day Daphne was killed, I was neither a journalist nor an activist. And I think Daphne's killing changed my life, as it changed the lives of quite a few people I know, friends I made that day and since, because, you know, if there was one conclusion we could all find, was that Daphne's killers could reach her because she was left alone. We watched her stories and her journalism like a spectator sport, not realizing, or perhaps not worrying enough about the danger she was putting herself in. We read the way she documented how Malta was taken over and Malta state was taken over and its institutions captured by a gang of criminals that wanted to use the trappings of a small European country in order to make money for themselves and their friends. But I think we all miscalculated that in order to protect the money they were making and the power they had managed to obtain, they would stop at nothing, including killing Daphne. Now, we were moved to go out on the street that week, but I think what also happened was that along with John, hundreds of other journalists flew in from the rest of the world into Malta. And they had many questions, not least the fact that they thought of Malta as this, holiday destination, this pretty island, where you wouldn't think of this violent scene of a car being blown up with a woman inside, killed because of her writing. And they asked why did this happen? They didn't get answers from the government. The government shut down that week. Just Prime Minister flew off to Dubai to sell passports, and just sat tight and wished the story away. And even the community of journalists in Malta didn't really have all the answers or any answers. Journalists had never been killed in Malta. And I don't think before then anyone really realized that this is a profession that can kill you. So I think we spent the last, speaking for myself, I spent the last 3 years trying to understand what happened, and trying to document what was happening in the aftermath, documenting the government's resistance and the attempts to frustrate criminal investigation by the police, finding out eventually that the cops themselves were bent and they were trying to look away from the reality of this crime. And this combination of documenting what's happening and writing about it, I became a full-time blogger. I stopped what I was doing before, and I just sat down to write about what was happening every day, and also trying to be one of those that were trying to shift things, move things in the direction the local government didn't want them to, in the direction of truth and the direction of justice.
Thank you. I'm thinking now about what you said, well, both of you said, about the shock of a journalist being assassinated, and in a European country at that. Recently, the Italian journalist Nello Scavo was in Malta fighting a case against an ex-government employee who had threatened him on Twitter. And he's taken it to court, and he's also supported by the Italian authorities in a way in which, of course, Daphne was not. One of the things that was said in the press conference after by the president of the NGO Repubblica, he said that any journalist that does their job as well as Daphne can fully expect to be killed. Manuel, I'll ask you first because you're in Malta.
Yes, right as we're recording this at this precise minute in Perugia, in Italy. There's a gathering of journalists, including Nello Scavo, who live under armed guard, effectively. And when Nello Scavo was here, I've worked with him. We've worked on stories about government policy, Italian and Maltese, on migrants, the most vulnerable people possible and imaginable. And because we've written those, we've stimulated the anger and provoked the anger of some very powerful and some very important people who have supporters in local tin pot fascist parties and activists. And we were walking together in the streets in Valletta on the day he was due to appear in court. And when we stepped out of the court building, we were met by a crowd of people haranguing us, insulting us, threatening us. And Nello Scavo turned to me and asked me, where's our security? It's not a happy thing for a journalist to have to live their lives under armed guard, protected from people who want to kill them. But it is clear that if Daphne had that, however unhappy she would have been with the inconvenience, the state would have done its duty and protected our right to know and to read what she had to write. And she wouldn't have been killed. And there are something like 24, 25 journalists in Italy who live that way. And it's not a happy thing to go through, but it is necessary because this place can be a strangely dangerous place. You know, I told you we never thought of this place as, you know, a place that kills journalists, but we knew we were working in a very dark area, and we didn't know what was at the bottom of it. Daphne went further than any of us. She dug until she stepped on some live wire that killed her.
Yeah.
What we've understood in the last 3 years is that there is a live wire there. We just don't know where it is. We just don't know where we're going to step on it. And the state absolutely refuses to protect the journalists working in this country for the simple reason that doing so may be perceived, and the government won't risk that, as giving them credibility. If they're in danger, then there must be a reason. This is what is so heroic about Daphne's story. The moment Daphne was killed was the moment too late for many people to realize that she must have been right.
Yeah. And what we've been seeing in the public inquiry, as well as all the stuff coming out in the compilation of evidence against Jorgen Fenech, is precisely that. I'll come back to public inquiry in a bit. But John, you mentioned the book that you wrote with Manuel and with Carlo Bonini, Murder on the Malta Express. And that was published 1 year ago on the 2nd anniversary of Daphne's assassination. Can you think about some of the things that you said in the book and how they connect with what we know now, 1 year on?
I'm immediately think of the last chapter, which is called "All Concerned Deny Any Wrongdoing," and we've got to say that. We've got to remember that the men who've been accused of actually carrying out the assassination, they pleaded not guilty, as I understand it. But anyway, the beauty of the book was that at this time, when we were writing it, we'd heard Manuel first, obviously because he knows what's going on in Malta, that Jorgen Fenech was implicated in the assassination. Now, as I understand it, he denies it, but the evidence is compelling against him. In particular, we found out that there was the middleman, the taxi driver, and that he was willing to give evidence and was waiting for a plea deal, and there was a jam with that. Now, we wanted to run what we knew, but we didn't want to let our book in some way damage the judicial process. We asked the family, and the family said, "Please don't put everything that you know in, because it might damage the judicial process." And so we didn't. But what we could do, and what we did do, is that we wanted Jorgen Fenech to know that we knew something about him. And so we put a series of questions to the lawyers of people like Joseph Muscat and Chris Cardona and Conrad Mitzi. But the last set of questions went to Jorgen Fenech. And we asked him, for example, is it true that that one of the men who was accused of killing Daphne had gambled in Jorgen Fenech's casino to the tune of something like 440,000 euros, and he'd won almost 400,000 euros, a fantastic amount of money. And yet this man was unemployed officially. So how could an unemployed man have access to that kind of money? Was there not some kind of anti-money laundering process which would have picked up that? And we kept on running the replies at the end of the book. And the last page, there's a denial from Fenech's lawyers, and then there's a very large picture of Daphne. And we heard, this may not be entirely true or all the reasons, but we heard after Fenech saw the book and read that bit of it, he got on his yacht and tried to do a runner. And that, journalism can be very depressing and very miserable and bleak at times. But that's one of the, when I heard that story, the publication of our book pushed, or was the straw that broke the camel's back, and Jorgen Fenech decided to do a runner. I love that story. I hope it's true.
Well, it was very soon afterwards that he did try and do that, Ronna. You know,
Yes.
your book was published, I think, just before the 16th of October 2019, in time for the 2 years anniversary. 2 minutes later, off Jorgen Fenwick went, or tried to.
It's a service we provide.
Well, thank you for providing it. No, thanks. To talk a bit about the public inquiry, which Manuel alluded to. So the public inquiry was set up almost exactly a year ago, and it was set up totally against the wishes of the Maltese government, who tried to stop it every which way. Now, the public inquiry was set up to discover if the Maltese state could have done anything to prevent Daphne being assassinated, and indeed what role the state played in her murder. Manuel, can you talk a bit about some of the revelations that have come out through the public inquiry, and also give me your response to the current Prime Minister's attempt to stop it?
Yes, look, it is not surprising that the government tried to stop it. You have to put yourself in the context that we had here. 6 weeks after Daphne's killing, the police arrested 10 people, then released 7 on police bail, and retained 3, charging them with the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. And these 3 people, we later found out, were likely involved in a series of hits. There were people Daphne had never written about, so she didn't know them, they didn't know her, and they were professional assassins. Joseph Muscat announced that news himself in a press conference. And basically the tone was case closed. We did our job, you see, we're serious about law enforcement here, and the matter stops there. But clearly the matter did not stop there, because someone had hired assassins, hired hands. And that is where all the obstruction to the judicial process, to the investigative process came along. However, any criminal investigation, is going to ask who killed and why. It's not going to examine the context in which it happened. When a journalist is killed, it's not like any other murder. I would compare it to the killing of a judge, for example, or the killing of a politician, an assassination, a political act. And for that, a criminal investigation is not enough to really find out what happened. You need to examine the political, the institutional context that allowed it to happen. Malta does not have a tradition of public independent inquiries, but Malta is a signatory of the European Convention on Human Rights, part of the Council of Europe. And the European Convention explains that the right to life includes the duty of the state to get to the bottom of cases where a life is denied, where someone is killed. The state is obliged to find out why that happened. For 2 years, as you rightly said, the government refused to call a public independent inquiry because it did not want a process that would examine some very painful questions. Did the Maltese government do everything in its power to prevent this murder? And there is a deeper question. Was the Maltese government involved in this murder? Or was the Maltese government doing enough to have the people who perpetrated this murder brought to justice? Or an even deeper question. Was the Maltese government involved in preventing the people involved in this, who perpetrated this murder from being brought to justice? Around the second anniversary of Daphne's killing, pressure from all over the world and from within Malta had really overwhelmed Joseph Muscat's government. The Prime Minister was at the end of his term. He was unable to retain his seat. And what he was trying to do was save himself as much as possible. So things he had blocked for 2 years, he was giving up on in hope of survival. And one of those things was the opening of the public independent inquiry. There was an effort to try to restrict its terms of reference, manipulate its composition, the composition of the board, ensure that the state continued to capture even that process. But too many people had involved in the effort to force the government to do this by then, including the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe, through its Parliamentary Assembly, had given the government of Malta a 3-month deadline to implement a proper inquiry or else. When the inquiry started a year ago, it duly started to ask tough questions. And the answers that came out were stunning, sometimes in them being so stupid, silly, or even silent. So we had, for example, the finance minister of Malta testifying at the inquiry in open court, saying at the time when all the corruption was happening, I was not an influential member of the government. All decisions were being taken in Joseph Muscat's kitchen by a kitchen cabinet. I, the finance minister, was not involved. The present foreign minister, Evarist Bartolo, repeated the same line by and large. But they said they continue to support Joseph Muscat in government because it was their duty as Labour Party politicians. You had senior civil servants admit to closing an eye or even signing off decisions, corrupt decisions that could never be justified and never be explained unless you accepted that people were being paid off and their pockets lined illegally. And the more we hear of this, the more we realize that there were 2 sets of people in the public administration in the time building up to Daphne's killing. A small set of people who were, part of this criminal conspiracy, and a large set of people who shut up, who were conditioned by omerta, that mafia code of silence. And then the other things that the inquiry discovered were that since Daphne was killed, there was a concerted effort of the police to look away. And that's because of the direct involvement and friendship and involvement in this mafia clan of, the top 3 police officials. Robert Abela, the new prime minister who took over from Joseph Muscat last January, is really impatient for this to be closed because he still wants the Labour Party to win the next election. An election must happen in the next year and a half or so, and it will be the first election since Daphne was killed. And the Labour Party has every intention of winning it. And the continued embarrassment of these weekly hearings that are coming out of the inquiry is not politically convenient. So he set a deadline for the 15th of December for the inquiry to shut down. Now, this shows just how Malta, or at least the Maltese government, has not learned anything from the real institutional problem that Malta had that led to Daphne's killing. And that is that on judicial matters, on police matters, on matters that should be completely independent of the Prime Minister still gets to call the shots. And the Prime Minister here is ordering the shutdown of an inquiry investigating the conduct of the government that he leads. That's seriously perverse. It's seriously perverse, and it should be the subject of inquiry itself. Today, the Times reported that the inquiry board intends to ignore the Prime Minister's deadline if it needs to. If there's more work to happen after the 15th of December, it intends to proceed with it.
Well, that's good news in amongst a lot of really bad stuff. So thanks for letting us know about that. The final question, really, so much has been exposed since Daphne was murdered. She was exposing so much corruption, and even more has come to light around her killing. I mean, it's a daily basis of information, revelations, exposés, and so on. How much longer do you really think this government can survive? I mean, you've had Keisha Kembry, Joseph Muscat's right-hand man, arrested the other week for allegations of kickbacks and money laundering, along with the Prime Minister's or ex-Prime Minister's accountants. Joseph Muscat has resigned twice, recently again from Parliament. How much longer do you really think this government can survive? And what will it take until we get justice for Daphne?
Okay, who's that question for?
John. I'll ask John.
Law must take its course, but there are people that you've mentioned, for example, Joseph Muscat. I'm still surprised that he hasn't been charged with anything, because I think he may well be innocent of the murder. I don't know, but what's clear is that he got in the way of the proper course of justice, and so the evidence of that, for example, is that the killers, or the men who've been accused of killing, they deny it, but the killers, and the evidence against them is compelling, were tipped off that they were going to be arrested. And the reason they did so was because, it seems, of a meeting in the Prime Minister's office. And information from that meeting eventually got to the killers. Well, how could that be? And surely there is a crime right there, and it happened inside the Prime Minister's office. Having said all that, I want to broaden it out a little bit, or actually a big bit, to the rest of the world, to, for example, Britain. So that what happened was that if it wasn't for dirty money, this tsunami of dirty money washing around the world and going through places like Malta, then Daphne would still be alive. There is a big, big problem, which is bigger than corruption in Malta, and that is the problem of dirty money corrupting governments and judges and the entire economic process in places like Britain and the United States. And all of the detail of the story, which Daphne exposed so brilliantly and magnificently when she was alive, are in weird and funny places, often with a crown on the stamps. Places like the British Virgin Islands and so forth and so on, where the dirty money flowed through. It flows through Malta, and then it gets to places in the States and in Britain, Rome, Paris, wherever. So, as well as a calling to account for the government of Malta, which one hopes, inshallah, that'll come the next election, but also through the proper course of law, the rest of the world must take account too, because this kind of crime against a brave and principled journalist will continue unless the whole world cleans up its act, unless we say truly to the dirty money merchants of the world, we're on your case, and we're going to fight you. We're going to fight back properly, because for the moment their calculation is, okay, we can bump off this journalist. They're annoying, bang, because actually our flow of dirty money is so great we can get away with it. So there needs to be a serious cleansing of governments across the world who enable this stuff, and that's got to start in Washington, D.C., and I believe that process is in play right now. In London, it's going to take a while, but nevertheless, we cannot forget what Daphne and her family have suffered, and we can't walk away from this. It's important, not just to Malta, but for the whole world. We've got to clean up our act.
John Sweeney, Manuel Delia, thanks so much for coming here tonight, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you.
And we are back now with Lizzie Eldridge. Lizzie, tell us, why do you think Daphne's work was so important?
What Daphne was exposing is not just about Malta. Many people think, in fact, John Sweeney in the interview emphasises it's not just about Malta. She was exposing criminality and corruption on a massive scale. She was also working on her own. She was very much on her own. She was targeted and harassed by the Maltese government, and she was very much alone in the work that she was doing. So why she's so important is because there she was described once as a one-woman WikiLeaks. She was adamant that she would keep going, and she was adamant that she would expose wrongdoing and she would expose injustice. In a time when journalists are being killed all over the world, when journalism is under attack, when we have the President of the United States talking about fake news all the time, and our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson putting journalism and media freedom under attack, it's more important than ever. I mean, it's always important, but emphatically so.
And we're on the third anniversary now. How has that anniversary been marked in Malta and elsewhere?
There's been lots of events this week. Because of COVID, most of the events are online. On Tuesday, there was the memorial lecture for Daphne that was given by the Sky News journalist Alex Crawford. Yesterday, there was an opening of an art installation by artists in Malta, in Valletta. Last night, activists from Occupy Justice, a women's-led group, put up billboards saying things like, a journalist killed, no justice. During the night, activists painted slogans on zebra crossings and so on. Today, there was a silent gathering in Bidnia, which is where Daphne lived and where she was killed. Later today, in fact, as we speak, Occupy Justice, Republica, another civil society NGO, and Manuel Delia, who was being interviewed, are releasing a new documentary called When They Come Undone, which is a full-length documentary which is being released as we speak.
And Daphne, since her death, and even to a certain extent before her death, but certainly since, has become a symbol for a lot of other journalists around the world. How have journalists and other bodies responded to this story?
We've had massive support. There are at least 19 media freedom NGOs who have been involved right from the start. They've been there in Malta, they've been there on the protests, they've been campaigning vociferously. Groups like Reporters Without Borders, PEN, Scottish PEN, IFEX, many different NGOs, media freedom NGOs, have been there supporting us, which is fantastic.
And I believe we are going to hear from one of those just now.
Yes, Rebecca Vincent, who's the Director of International Campaigns from Reporters Without Borders, has kindly submitted a video contribution for our programme tonight.
Excellent. Well, let's see that now.
Reporters Without Borders has been involved in the campaign for justice for Daphne Caruana Galizia from the very start. So for 3 years now, we've worked alongside Daphne's family, Maltese civil society, and other international NGOs seeking full justice for this horrific attack. To us, full justice means that every person involved in every aspect of this attack is identified and persecuted to the full extent of the law. And that means all hitmen, all middlemen, and all masterminds. That has not yet happened. There has been progress. There have been some significant arrests, although none of the accused have yet been brought to trial. And there was a significant victory in achieving the establishment of an independent public inquiry to look into Daphne's assassination. But none of these steps have come easily. At every stage, the Maltese government has made it extremely difficult for her family and for civil society to achieve necessary steps towards justice. So the steps that have been achieved have been despite and not because of the Maltese authorities. The public inquiry was particularly significant because under Joseph Muscat's leadership, the Maltese government resisted it at every step of the way. The reason it was eventually successful was because of sustained, concerted advocacy efforts with international institutions, in particular the Council of Europe, where Special Rapporteur Peter Omtzigt put a time clock on the need to establish this public inquiry in a key resolution from last June. Now, eventually, the Maltese authorities complied, but that also resulted in months of negotiations with Daphne's family about the composition of the board of inquiry and the terms under which they would work. Finally, though, it was launched in December of 2019. And today, at the 3-year mark, the public inquiry continues. It is coming to an end. Okay, I'll pick back up because everything else was fine. Today, at the 3-year anniversary, the public inquiry continues, although the current Prime Minister, Robert Abela, has attempted to unduly interfere with the work of the Board of Inquiry, Reporters Without Borders, along with a group of NGOs, has called for him not to interfere, to allow the public inquiry to run its course. It is tremendously important that the integrity and independence of this inquiry is preserved, or else the work of the past year, nearly year, will be for naught. The public inquiry has yielded some very shocking truths about aspects of the climate in Malta that led up to Daphne's assassination, and crucially the fact that it could have been prevented. My colleague Pauline Addis-Meville testified about the press freedom climate in the country and said clearly, and this is a belief that we still hold at Reporters Without Borders, that there were signs that this could happen to Daphne and that her assassination could have been prevented. Now, this is one aspect that the public inquiry is supposed to uncover, is the question of whether the state should have known or could have known about this assassination, whether they could have acted to prevent it, but also crucially, what lessons can be drawn for the future. Because journalists who continue to do the sort of in-depth investigative reporting that Daphne did do so at great risk. Malta's press freedom record has fallen 31 places on our World Press Freedom Index since Daphne was killed. This was not just an issue of an assassination, but Daphne's assassination shed light on a broader climate of impunity, of systemic failings, of problems with rule of law and democratic institutions in Malta. And still to this day, the other recommendations of bodies like the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the European Parliament and others have gone unheeded. When we look at the mass protests from last year and then political resignations that followed, there was hope internationally that maybe things were changing in Malta. But unfortunately, what we've seen so far is, although the faces may have changed, nothing underneath has. Journalists remain at risk in Malta. We have serious concerns about the media ownership climate and about other press freedom issues in the country, and there are still institutional failings with regard to democratic institutions that need to be addressed. So now, 3 years after the horrific killing of Daphne Caruana Galizia, we call again for justice, and we call again for the broader reforms that are desperately needed to ensure that this cannot be allowed to happen to any other journalist or any other person in Malta.
Yeah, that's good. Could you talk a bit about the significance of marking Daphne's anniversary and what it means to you, and why do you think it's important to mark?
The anniversary each year in Daphne's case is of tremendous importance to us at Reporters Without Borders, but also to me personally. I'm really disappointed that this is the first year I haven't been able to travel to the country to mark this important day in person with Daphne's family, with civil society, and with the people of Malta. One message that I've often tried to convey in my previous travels to the country is that the international community is watching, that the world cares, that we see the fight for democracy and justice in Malta, and that they have support from abroad. Because we know how embattled people on the ground are feeling. There have been many obstacles in the pursuit of justice in this case. But at the same time, there has been tremendous progress, and that is a message I try to often convey. When we work on the killings of journalists in any country, we see more often than not total or partial impunity. And the progress that has been made in Daphne's case, although it's not yet enough, is remarkable compared to most other cases. This is one reason that the campaign for justice for Daphne remains so important to us. It's one of our top global priorities because Daphne's case is emblematic. She represents, in a way, all journalists, and the fact that this has been allowed to happen in an EU state means that if it's not addressed fully, if there is not full justice for this attack, the door is open for further violence against journalists in Malta and beyond. That would send the wrong signal to those wishing to use violence to silence critical voices or to stop investigations that they don't like, that they can do so carte blanche. We will make sure that that does not happen. I have promised, and we promise again on the 3-year mark, that we will stick with this, that we will continue the fight for full justice no matter what.
So, Lizzie, we're very nearly out of time. So if people want to learn more about Daphne's case, where can they find that information?
Well, there are many different places that people can try, but I would suggest the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. You can find them on Twitter, you can find them on their website, you can find them on Facebook. And this was a foundation set up by Daphne's oldest son, Matthew. That's the place I would go to first. There are many different organisations. You can try Reporters Without Borders, Occupy Justice, Republica, Manuel Delia. You can find them all on Facebook, but the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation is probably the go-to place, the first place I would advise people to go.
Well, Lizzie, I want to thank you and everyone else who participated in tonight's show. It's been really fascinating, and thank you for keeping us here at Broadcasting Scotland in touch with this story throughout the process. It has been a difficult case, I think, to report on, but one that, as you've said and as others have said, is very important that we do report on. So thank you so much for everything you've done.
Thank you.
And that is all we have time for this evening. So thank you once again to Lizzie Eldridge and to everyone else who we've heard from tonight, John Sweeney, Manuel Delia and Rebecca Vincent. All of them have been an important part of this show and of this campaign. So thank you very much for their time. And thank you at home for joining us as well. There would be no point in making these shows at all if we didn't have an audience. So thank you very much for that. We do have to ask, if you're able to support us, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us to build a better broadcaster for Scotland. If you're not able to support us financially, you can still help us in a big way by following us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, by liking our Facebook page, by subscribing to our YouTube channel, and then sharing the shows around with your friends and family. Let them know why you support Broadcasting Scotland, and hopefully you can encourage them to give us a try as well. And finally, we want to keep building Broadcasting Scotland, but to do that, we do need more hands. So if you're interested in any way in getting involved here, whether that's behind the camera or in front of it, do please get in touch with us. We have lots of work to be done, and we would love for you to help with it. But that is absolutely all we have time for. So once again, thank you very much to Lizzie Eldridge for joining us. Thank you at home for joining us as well. I'll be back on Sunday with the full Scottish, but until then, have a great weekend. Good night. My name's Kenny McBride, and I'm a journalist with Broadcasting Scotland. We've been covering the Daphne Caruana Galizia case for around 2 years now, thanks in large part to our friend Lizzie Eldridge. Lizzie has not only helped us keep on top of all the developments in the case, but has also been a constant reminder of the moral imperative to keep Daphne's story in the spotlight. Daphne was killed because she spoke the truth, and that truth was dangerous to some very powerful people. They then used that power to silence her in the most brutal way possible. For those of us who call ourselves journalists, Daphne's murder is both terrifying and also a powerful call to action. Terrifying because this kind of thing shouldn't be possible in a modern European democracy. We're supposed to be safe. And it's a call to action because the fact of her death shows how important it is to ensure her work and her journalistic spirit don't die with her. If the truth she revealed had been acted on just a wee bit sooner, she might still have been alive today, rooting out more corruption and exposing more lies. Sadly, she's gone, but she leaves us with an example to follow. It's up to us to keep the truth of both the work and the spirit of Daphne Caruana Galizia alive.
It's 3 long years since the brutal murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and yet this Maltese government refused to give an inch in the search for justice. It's clear that the family and the friends of Daphne and the reputation of her deserve more than they're getting from this government. It's incumbent on all of us to keep the fight going, to keep the public pressure on, and to try our hardest to ensure that we get justice for this wonderful woman, this courageous journalist.
The assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia was a direct product of the deliberate failings of the Maltese state, but more broadly, it was a result of international indifference to financial crime and the suppression of freedom of expression. Justice for Daphne requires not only that all of the perpetrators of the crime be brought to justice, but that international legal reform prevents a repetition of a situation in which a journalist is the last line of defence for the rule of law.
Daphne, Marielle, your deaths have not been in vain. And those who murdered you must know they cannot hide their guilt forever. For what is hidden shall come to light. And no matter what they say or what they do, they cannot stop the change that is coming. And one day, we will all be free.
The murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia was such a scandalous act of barbarism that it's easy to forget it was anything but random. Rather, it was carefully planned and executed with a definite intention. I'm sure the perpetrators thought the murder would silence criticism and pose a threat across the European community, as well as giving a lead to similarly minded bullies. The result has been exactly the opposite. Rather, its repercussions have reached the highest level of the Maltese government, and they are anything but finished. It simply will not go away, and the continued series of lies and obfuscation have served to do nothing but keep the memory alive. By killing Daphne Caruana Galizia, her murderers have given her cause an international dimension it would have otherwise been difficult to achieve, and have, in fact, won her case for her. Scottish Pen was an early supporter of calls for justice, and that is still our position. We are happy to lend our voice and support to the continuing battle for dignity, truth, and justice.
It feels really strange not to be in Malta this year. It feels really odd. So I just wanted to be able to send all my love to all my friends and fellow activists in Malta, and most particularly to say hello to Daphne's family. You're never ever out of my thoughts, and you're always in my heart, and I really miss you. I'd also like you to know that there are many of us here in Scotland fighting for justice for Daphne. It's an international struggle, it's a global issue. Only recently, the president of the EU Council described Daphne's assassination. He said it was shameful for the whole of Europe, and so it is. The crimes that Daphne was exposing and the reason why she was so brutally assassinated, these are about global networks of criminality, and we know this, and they're really dangerous, and they have to be stopped. It's 3 years since Daphne was brutally assassinated, but the fight for justice has only got stronger every single day, and it's a fight that we will win. There's no question about that. We shall win. I'd like to finish with a quote from an American writer called Anne Lamott, and it reminds me of a very powerful image created by the Maltese artist Seb Tanti-Berlo, and he produced this shortly after Daphne was murdered. If you are writing the clearest, truest words you can find, and doing the best you can to understand and communicate, this will shine on paper like its own little lighthouse. Lighthouses don't go running all over an island looking for boats to save. They just stand there shining. This is Daphne.